Hello, this is Elliot Campos from the RRFC, here to talk to you today about the art of podcasting. If you have any questions at all, please type it in the box and I will address it at the end of this video. Now, a lot of young adults or adults who have yet to enter into the entertainment industry, a lot of them think that they can just go from 0 to 100. Working part-time at McDonald's or some retail job and then get discovered and all of a sudden have their own radio show or platform to entertain the masses. The way the world works is that you need to show that you have that talent, that aptitude to be out there in the entertainment industry. And a great way to get your start is to podcast. Now, a podcast isn't that complicated. It's basically people talking, upload it to the internet, people download it and listen. And then, if you have a website with some additional bells and whistles, maybe a message board or a Facebook page or a Twitter page, you can definitely build an audience. And then all of a sudden, you have people who enjoy your brand. And hey, wouldn't they be interested if you made a feature-length film or, a web series or you got on the radio? Wouldn't they tune in and listen? That's the idea with a podcast. It's not something that's going to make you rich. It's not something that's going to live on forever in the annals of history, but it's something that can get people to know you, something that people can be excited about, and as things change and evolve in your career, have people follow you there. So let's talk about how you get a podcast going. Now, a lot of the most successful podcasts have, comedians on it or, guest stars every week. And if you're just somebody in a flyover state in the United States, for example, you probably don't have access to Chris Hardwick or Kumail Nanjiani or any of these successful podcast types. But that's okay. There's a very successful podcast right now called The Worst Idea of All Time. And it's about, the podcast features two not famous comedians from New Zealand or something to that effect. And they watch Grown Ups 2 or Sex and the City 2 every week and just talk about that experience. Watching one horrible movie for an entire year, 52 weeks, and just talking about how their minds are slowly devolving. And that concept hooked a lot of people. It got them noticed by Paul Scheer, who does the How Did This Get Made podcast, very successful. And these guys not only built an audience, but they were able to fundraise the money to come out to Los Angeles from their other country and watch Grown Ups 2 for the final time in a big theater here in Los Angeles. So these guys, just by doing a podcast, were able to not only build their brand, but get recognition in multiple countries. Now, if you're somebody who nobody's heard of, you have no entertainment work to speak of, just having a good idea for a podcast, creating a good hour of audio entertainment every week is something that can definitely get you noticed. And when you're trying to land that good job opportunity, it's definitely going to raise some eyebrows and put you ahead of those other people who have just been, sitting on their mom's couch playing video games. So now let's talk about how you get your podcast going. What you're going to want to do is, first off, find a co-host. A friend who you really enjoy talking to, you can see talking to every week for an hour or two. You're going to have topics and things that you enjoy, shared points of interest, different ideas about certain things, so there's a good back and forth. With your co-host, you're going to want to find somebody who you're really comfortable with, that you have long, nerdy conversations with anyway. Because the first, most important thing about your podcast is that it has to be fun for you. If you're not enjoying the experience, the listeners aren't going to enjoy it either. They don't want to listen to you just rattle off the facts off of baseball cards. Everybody can just go to Wikipedia for that. What they're going to want to do is look to you for your insight, your sense of humor, what you have to say about your topic. So once you determine your co-host, you can also figure out what you're going to talk about. Now, I've been involved in podcasts where it's just like, hey, me and my friend, we're just going to talk about whatever we care to talk about this week. And the problem with that is that it's just not optimized for search engines, you know? Nobody's going to look through a phone book and Google that person's name to see if they have a podcast and give it a shot. You want to make a podcast about a topic that you're passionate about. A lot of people do podcasts about their favorite TV show or bad movies or sports teams, comic books, video games. You know, you want to find a topic that you're very interested in, it's very passionate for you, and that has a big audience, so that when people are Googling, say, the TV show Supernatural, they find your podcast about Supernatural, start listening to it, and then you've attached yourself to a successful brand so that you can build your audience. One of the podcasts that I've done was called Superhero Sampler. And the idea with that show is that myself and my co-host would every week watch a random episode of a random superhero television show, you know, going from Super Friends to Beware the Batman to Batman 66, you know, all across the map of television shows that have featured superheroes. And what's great about that, every week was a completely different superhero TV show, so that the people who liked Spider-Man, the people who liked Powerpuff Girls, the people who liked Earthworm Jim, The Tick, The Cape, Freakazoid, Superman, you know, X-Men, all these shows we covered in an episode of our podcast, so that when somebody would Google, hey, I want to listen to a podcast about Wolverine, Google Wolverine podcast, our show would come up. And then if they liked the episode that we did, they could look at our podcast and like, oh, you know, I like Spider-Man too. Let me listen to this Spider-Man one. Ooh, I really like the Hulk. Let me listen to this podcast episode about the 1970s Hulk TV show. And from there, they just started downloading all the episodes. So it was something where there was enough of a hook that got people interested from all comic book superhero interests. And then once they sampled it, they would listen to other episodes and subscribe. And the podcast is kind of on hiatus right now. It should be returning within a couple weeks or months to a new website with a new co-host. But the great thing about that was that all we had to do was just watch an episode of TV, like 20, 40 minutes, and then just get together and talk about it. And it was fun. And that's what you need to look for. You know, whether you're going to watch a Tom Cruise movie every week, whether you're just going to talk about the great TV shows that you enjoy, you know, maybe you're going to talk about, you know, binge watching that you've been doing on Netflix. You know, just something where people who enjoy those properties can find your podcast, get your perspective on it, and then become a fan of you. That's what you really want to do. Now, once you have this podcast going, you're definitely going to want to get like a good microphone like this. What I do, like the early episodes of Superhero Sampler have horrible microphone usage. As we went further along, we got a better microphone. We just put it between us. It's omnidirectional, so it records both of us. And that captures the sound quality a lot better. You definitely, one of the episodes on there, the microphone settings were tweaked, and it was just like horrible crackling the entire time. And you definitely don't want that to happen. What's really frustrating, and the various podcasts I'm on, it's happened multiple times, that you record an entire episode and then something's wrong with the audio and then you have to record all of it again. That is the absolute worst, because when you record a podcast, you know, maybe you have some jokes in mind, but for the most part, you're just talking off the cuff, and it's fun because you're like engaged in conversation with your friend. But then if the audio doesn't work out and you have to re-record the entire thing, you're just kind of soullessly repeating everything you said. So you definitely want to make sure that the audio is working out right. So what a lot of people do is they connect it to their computer, the microphone to their computer. That's how they record it. I record it in GarageBand, which is a free program on the MacBook Pro. Other people use Logic or Ableton, some kind of professional recording software. And when you have this going, plug in headphones or something. What I do is I just watch the audio gain on the computer just to make sure everything's going. Sometimes I'll be like, hey, timeout, and I'll just listen to the podcast and make sure everything sounds okay. We'll do a test run, just to make sure everything's fine. And then, once you get in your hour, typically podcasts are, you don't want to go over like an hour. You can kind of do whatever you want. It's kind of like the Wild West. There are no hard and fast rules. But get your 20 minutes, half hour, what have you, get that done. And then once you have that recorded, you got to edit it. Occasionally, when you're having a conversation with someone, there are going to be long pauses. I was recording a podcast and my landlord knocked on my door and I had to attend to an issue at my apartment. And you don't want to keep that in the podcast because it's not interesting to hear me walk out of the room and have this little conversation about nothing with the landlord and resolve that issue. You want to kind of stay focused. It's fun to do digressions, go into like weird side pockets of conversation. But if you're having to deal with the mailman dropping off a package and signing for it, you're kind of wasting your listeners' time. So you have to cut all that out. And what you'll also notice when you start editing your podcast is that you're going to use a lot of, this thing like, what's it called? This thing. You'll definitely notice that, and it's going to drive you crazy. Because in all our minds, we are, smooth talkers. We're very great. We speak exactly what's in our heads, get it out there, and everything's great. But when you actually take a tape recorder to yourself, we all talk like morons a lot of the time. I took a speech seminar several years ago, and one of the things I learned from that was the concept of filler words. It's just that our mouths move faster than our brains sometimes, or that might be vice versa. And basically what it is that when we're talking, we don't want to stop talking. So when we have to think about what word we need to say next, instead of stopping the talk out of our mouths, we just continue verbalizing. And when we have nothing to say in that moment, instead of pausing, we do and that in podcast form is super annoying. I remember in school back in the day, I was listening to a presentation from a classmate, and he was basically just reading his paper and then going off of that, expanding on the topic. But he would say like and multiple times with every sentence. It was like, this thing like, there's some apple juice, and this apple juice is like, it's this drink that's very good. It's made from the apples, and with the apples are condensed into liquid, and then you drink it. That's a horrible presentation. You don't want to do that. And if you want to be on the radio someday, if you want to have a talking platform, you really need to cut that out of your system right now. Listen to the radio sometime. Listen to the morning zoo cruise on the radio. Pay attention to how many times they say they don't really. They just say exactly what they want to say. And honestly, that's a skill. It's not that difficult. All you have to do is when you're talking, you just have to really concentrate a little bit. Just focus on what you're saying and be willing to pause. It's really easy to do us. I'm focusing on not doing them right now. But when you are in a professional setting, you want to be the best you can be. And if you are constantly uttering these nonsense words, you're not going to impress anybody. So what's great about a podcast is it helps you become a better speaker because you're the one who has to edit your words. You're the one who has to take out all those stutters and nonsense little bits of business. So it's definitely great practice. Absolutely. Now, in terms of getting it out there, there are a number of podcast hosts that you can use. I use Libsyn, Libsyn. It's not that expensive. And then you can upload it from there to iTunes, which is the premier podcast hub. That's where everybody gets their podcasts. It's the podcast app on your phone. All that comes from iTunes. So you don't want to just have it on your... I have a Blogspot account because, again, that's free, and I am not a millionaire. And with Blogspot, I have everything there, all the cast information, so that's nice. But with... I think it's Blogger now, actually, excuse me. I'm getting up there in years. But with iTunes, that's something that everybody knows it. Everybody can find it. It's very easy, very accessible. Get it on there. Get your search-enabled topic clearly in the headline. And then market yourself a little bit with Facebook and Twitter. You know, build an audience by being in contact with people. You can get reviews on iTunes. That's great. But if you can build a community at all, a space where people can get updates on what's going on in the podcast, that's something that can only benefit you. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention really quick is coming to me in just one moment. Oh, something that can really aid you in terms of building your podcast is guest starring on other people's podcasts. Now, if you're in a small town without a lot of entertainment people in it, that's probably going to be difficult. But Skype exists, so you can always meet people online and Skype into their podcasts. Otherwise, if you live in a well-populated city, if you can meet up with anybody, you know, find people online, see what people are doing in the podcast world. If you find anybody, connect with anybody like that. I live in Los Angeles, so I've met a lot of people who do podcasts, and I've asked to be on people's podcasts. I've been invited to be on people's podcasts. And what's fun about that is that it allows you to mix things up a little bit, do a podcast, but talking about a different topic, a new way of doing things. But what's really good is that you can plug your own podcast. So if you appear on a very popular podcast and at the end of the show, you know, after doing all your vocal wonderment, after gifting that podcast audience with yourself, they think, hey, I really like that guy or girl. I want to follow them to their own podcast. You just let them know what it is. And, you know, sometimes you get new downloads, a new audience. And a big part of getting that audience is just spreading it out. One of the first podcasts I did was called Beyond School. It is an audio play about a teenage girl fighting aliens at her high school. I'm a screenwriter by trade, if not by income. And for me, I thought it would be really fun to do that kind of thing. It's hard for people to sit down and read a 100-page script. But with a podcast, that's something you can just listen to while you're working out or on your morning commute. So it's basically my chance to tell a story and have people listen to it, follow along with it. I've gotten really great reactions from it, but the problem is it's not search engine friendly because it's an original story. It's my name's on it, the actors' names are on it, but they're mostly unknowns. I'm an unknown. So there's no real reason for people to be able to find it. So that was one of the reasons I created the Superhero Sampler podcast, because nobody knows what my little sci-fi audio play thing is, but everybody knows who Bruce Wayne is. People are going to be interested in listening to a podcast about the 90s Batman the Animated Series, or Batman the Brave and the Bold, or Beware the Batman. There have been a lot of Batman TV shows. And with that Superhero Sampler podcast, I have gotten audience members to come over to Beyond School because they really like the vibe that I was putting down, so to speak. Now, once you get your podcast up there on iTunes, you upload your one episode. You're going to want to update them pretty regularly. Generally, once a week is good. If you can always update it on the same day, that's cool, because then people know when to expect you to have new content. That's really helpful in terms of building an audience, to know when you're going to be delivering. So don't overburden yourself. I would say find something that you enjoy, that you like, that you are confident that you can continue creating that content. If you only update once a quarter, you're going to lose subscribers really fast. I recently was on a podcast. They were telling me that they update pretty regularly, but then they had to take a month or two off due to personal reasons, and their subscribers just plunged because people, they have their app that updates for them, and if there are no podcast episodes coming in, they just think, oh, well, this podcast must be dead or something. So they just delete it from their queue. If you have to take a sabbatical or something, that's what the Facebook or Twitter page is for. So you can inform your fans, hey, I'm going to be in the Caribbean for 2 weeks, so we're unfortunately not going to be able to produce any more episodes. Or, of course, you can record a couple episodes in advance and have them auto-update, so that's taken care of. Otherwise, you can also notify people at the end of the last episode you record. Just say, hey, there's not going to be any episodes for a couple weeks, but stay tuned because we are going to be back talking about this subject. What else do I need to talk about?
Getting an audience, growing your audience.
Okay. Well, I talked about that.
We'll go into more depth of it. You have 20 minutes.
Okay. All right. What can I say?
I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Yeah. I just cut right to the bone, like right there.
Just go right to the bone. I don't know. Is it worth getting into things?
Well, I can answer this question.
Yeah, you can throw that question in there.
Okay.
You go. Some of the trouble that might be presented by having a podcast of difficulties. Is it worth getting into hardware, software too much? Or do you think it's pretty straightforward for someone?
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, there's a lot of guides online, so.
Yeah.
Hey, let's answer a question from the mailbag. So this question comes from J.M. Rapton. What would be the reason for discouraging podcast? So I'm guessing he's asking what the downsides of doing a podcast are. I would say that the main concern would be if you're appearing on someone else's podcast or you have someone else do your editing and they just upload it. Because the thing about a podcast is once you say it, it's recorded. So again, this is a skill that you need to have, because if you're going to be on the radio or on TV or something, once the camera catches you saying something or doing something that makes you not proud of it, it's there forever and it'll get out there and then you're done. So there have been a lot of, you've probably seen them on Facebook or YouTube. I remember I saw this clip of a news anchor who didn't realize his mic was on and he said some profanities on the air and he got fired just like that, because public news stations, they don't really appreciate their news broadcasters saying filthy words. So what you need to think about when you're on somebody else's podcast is just think about what you're saying. You know, there are things that might sound funny in the moment, but really think if it's something that you can stand behind. You know, I definitely had times where I said something and it's like, ooh, I wish I didn't say that, because I didn't mean anything offensive by it. But, you know, when taken out of context, it really makes me look like a jerk. So you need to be careful about that. But if you're editing your own podcast, then if you say something stupid, you can just cut it out. I can't do that Full House thing. You can just cut it out. The other thing that I want to mention about this question, what would be the downside of doing a podcast? The bigger downside to you as a creative would be just doing nothing. I mentioned earlier that people think they can just go from 0 to 100, and that's not the case. You need to work at it, develop your skills. You're not going to be directing Avatar as your first movie, but you can work up to that as you grow as a filmmaker. I don't know what the best radio station in the United States is, but you wouldn't start there. You wouldn't start at ESPN. That's a guess if they have a radio station. You wouldn't start there. You'd start at like a local radio station. And then once you develop your skills, you can grow, you can advance. With podcasts, it's a way for you to not only develop your skills as a public speaker, as someone who can speak regularly, who can speak with confidence and skill, say funny things, say charming things, make people like you just through the words you say. But you also have content that can make people excited about you. So you really want to, as somebody who does not yet have the keys to the creative kingdom, if you can create things, that has the potential to be the key that unlocks the door to your success. So maybe a podcast, if you don't feel that a podcast is the best thing for you, maybe it isn't. You know, maybe you need to start writing, or maybe you need to start a web series. But it's always better to be doing something as opposed to sitting on your hands. As somebody who hires in the industry, as somebody who is looking for people to hire, it's always more impressive if the student, the job applicant, can actually back up their words. You can say that you studied under this screenwriter, but if you've never written a screenplay, why would you be hired to write a movie? You know, if you think that you can be on the radio, that's great. But if you don't have any proof, then they're not going to put you on the radio. With a podcast, it's an easy way to build experience over multiple years, so that when you go out to become a broadcaster on the radio, when you look for that job opportunity, you can show the employer that, hey, I've been doing this podcast every week for 2 years. We have a lot of subscribers. We've been updating really regularly. You can take a listen to it and see just what a great asset to the radio station you would be. One of the problems that I've noticed with several friends who have started podcasts is that they don't get downloads right away. You know, they'll do podcasts for several weeks or several months and they get one download or something. And it really discourages them and they kind of stop and trail off. And the thing that's important to note is that it takes time to build your audience, to build your brand. You know, there have been a lot of podcasts that I've discovered. I listened to the Nerdist podcast for the first time last year, and now I've just been going through all the old episodes and listening to them. I didn't listen to those when they first went up 6 years ago, but I'm listening to them now. So it's a thing where if you keep working consistently, as you build your audience, as people find your show, they'll go back and listen to the old ones. With the Superhero Sampler podcast I did, the great thing is that when people discovered it, they would download all the old ones. So there would be days when we only got 2 or 3 downloads. There would be other days when we got about 80 downloads, because people listen to the old ones when they discover your show. The great comparison for this one would be stand-up comedians. When a stand-up starts as a performer doing comedy clubs, usually they just have to do an open mic where nobody's paying attention, if there are even people in the comedy club at all. And it's very discouraging because they worked really hard on their material, but no one cares. And the sad truth is, for a lot of entertainers, for many, many years, nobody cares. I can't tell you how many stories I've read about a writer or director or actor who moves to the big city and it takes them years to get noticed. Nobody has any interest in their projects. But once everything takes off, everybody cares. Everybody wants to see everything they've done. So you have to invest in yourself. Like I said, if you're sitting at home playing video games, doing nothing, nothing's going to happen. If you try, if you create things and put stuff out there, you increase your odds dramatically. The other example I want to go into is the Nerdist Network. You know, Chris Hardwick had the host of the Nerdist podcast. He had success previously in his life. He was the host of Singled Out, I believe, which was a program on MTV in the early 90s, a dating show. I don't know how many of our students are familiar with it, but it did exist. And with the Nerdist podcast, he wasn't working a lot, and he just decided, hey, I'm really into this podcast scene that's taking off. Let me reach out to my friends, all my comedian friends, and just start a show. And after he had done that for quite a while, it just took off. He not only was able to create an entire network of podcasts, including Kumail Nanjiani's The X-Files Files and many others. The X-Files Files is the main one I know. Not only created this entire podcast network, but he was also able to get At Midnight, which is a show on Comedy Central, I believe, as well as The Talking Dead, which follows The Walking Dead on AMC. Both of those kind of panel shows, talk shows, comedy shows. But he wouldn't have had those opportunities if the Nerdist hadn't been so successful. So you have a chance to create something that will really register with something. And all you need is just a microphone, somebody to talk to, and a topic. That's it. Now, in terms of a feature film, that's going to take locations, sets, actors, cameras, lights, a humongous expense, many thousands of dollars. A podcast is a cheap way to get content out there and build your brand, get people excited about you. If you can get people excited about you just by what you have to say, then that means they're not just interested in this comic book character you created. They're interested in you as a person. And as I said earlier, if you start another project, they're a lot more likely to follow you. And you need that audience there. If you can create yourself as a brand, much like popular comedian Kevin Hart did, sky's the limit, my friends. The sky is the limit. I don't know.
How about like revenue streams? Have you touched on that?
Okay. In terms of revenue streams, getting money from your podcast, there was a period several years ago where that was happening. Now it's not so much, but if you keep at it, you build your audience. If you're getting hundreds of downloads a day, there are definitely ways you can get a little bit of scratch for what you're doing. The main thing you've probably heard if you've listened to any podcasts are doing ads for Audible or Warby Parker, just taking a little time out of your podcast to just plug this other company. And then they'll, toss you a little bit of kickback. And that's something where it's not going to make you rich, but it could cover your hosting fees, your cost of doing business. And that's definitely something that is appreciated. Every dollar counts. And the other thing that's really interesting that a lot of people do is Patreon, which is a website that allows people to donate regularly to your show. They can pledge $1, for example. And then every time you update your podcast, they'll give you another $1. So it's basically a way for the audience to show, hey, I really like you. I really support you. I want to keep this going. I want to help you keep this going. Now, with Patreon, you don't want to do it like your first couple weeks. That's something once you built the audience, then you can really say, hey, I'm creating this Patreon page to help support the show. The other option would, the other important thing about Patreon is there are rewards available. So a lot of people will create extra content if certain donation goals are met. A lot of people will invite donators to be on the show. You know, I know one podcast called Dusted, which is a Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast. Very good television program. This podcast, they actually have a voicemail, and they let their listeners call into the voicemail, record a message, and sometimes they'll play the messages on the show. So you definitely want to keep audience interactivity open. Listener questions is another great way that several podcasts do it. Just taking questions over Twitter or Facebook, much the same way we answered J.M. Rapton's question from earlier. Just a way to keep that interactivity going. With your podcast, you definitely want to listen to your audience. If they really enjoy a certain episode about a certain topic, if it gets downloads through the roof, maybe you get emails about it. Hey, I really love this. Maybe return to that topic a little later. See if you have more ground to cover. If you do an episode that gets 0 downloads, 0 interest, maybe stay away from that. You know, you really need to pay attention to everything that's going on, to how the world is reacting to your podcast. And again, that's why Facebook and Twitter are great, because you have that interactivity going. You have a way for fans to reach you. And hopefully, if you're doing it right, you'll get a fan or two. And if you want to see yourself here at the top of the charts, just put in the hard work and energy and you can make it happen. Now, let's talk about your questions.